Hello, everyone. I'm Allison Cullen. I'm the interim dean of the Evans School, and I want to welcome all of you to the Dean's Forum on Race and Public Policy. Can you guys all hear me? Looks like the sound's working. We are co-hosting today with UW Center for an Informed Public, which I'm really excited about. The Dean's Forums are a venue for engaging conversations about race and public policy, both inside the Evans School and also in the broader community. Really great to have so many people joining us for this election 2020 retrospective. Our special focus today is election outcomes. So we're looking at the impact of information and disinformation campaigns and also the importance of policy and legal approaches to protecting and restoring voter rights. A really critical step toward anti-racism in our public institutions involves acknowledging and addressing the disproportionate impact of systematic voter suppression on communities of color, and also actions to restore and protect voting access. A huge thanks to Jevin West, director of the UW Center for an Informed Public, who's co-moderating with me, and to our panel, who I'll introduce in a minute. And just a quick note, please watch during winter and spring quarters for additional Dean's Forum events with incoming Dean Jody Sanford, who's joining us in January 2021, which is coming right up. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that I'm addressing you from the land of the Coast Salish peoples. This is the land upon which the University of Washington was built. Their ancestors have resided here since time immemorial, and they continue to live in this place today, deeply rooted in their cultural traditions. Land acknowledgement is a traditional practice in many Indigenous communities, and long before the UW was founded, Coast Salish communities were in relationship with this land where we work and study and engage. Recognizing these beginnings reminds us of the importance of centering Indigenous, Black, and other communities of color within our Evans community, and also of our own connection to this land. In the chat bar, you'll see a link where you can learn more about the land where you live and work. Okay, when we planned tonight's panel for 1 month after the election, the idea was to take a retrospective look at outcomes, who voted and how, and what spurred or thwarted voting. And there were definitely times in the last month when I wondered whether 1 month out we would be able to discuss outcomes yet. But at this point, although the dust hasn't fully settled, the country has a transition process underway after a really historic election of President-elect Joe Biden and Vice President-elect Kamala Harris, and we have plenty to discuss. We have two really terrific panelists to help us dig into the topic, Patrick Berry and Kate Starbird. Patrick is a fellow and counsel in the Brennan Center's Democracy Program, where he focuses on voting rights restoration and promoting fair, diverse, and impartial courts. During law school, Patrick was a law clerk at Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington and open primaries. He received a BA from the University of Central Florida and JD from University of Pennsylvania Law School. Kate Starbird is an associate professor in the Department of Human-Centered Design and Engineering at University of Washington. Kate's research sits in the field of crisis informatics, the study of how social media and other communication technologies are used during crisis events. Currently, her work focuses on the production and spread of online rumors, misinformation, and disinformation. Kate's also a co-founder of the UW Center for an Informed Public. She has a BS from Stanford and a PhD in Technology, Media, and Society from University of Colorado. So I want to thank Kate and Patrick again for joining us. We're in really good hands. And now let me turn it over to my co-moderator, Jevin West.
Great. Thanks so much, Allison. Can you hear me? Perfect. So I want to first thank Allison so much and the whole team at the Evans School for collaborating on this. I think it was the perfect kind of event that we were interested in doing, especially given a lot of the effort that we put in as a center around monitoring real-time misinformation before, during, and now after the election. December 3rd is actually a pretty special day for the Center for an Informed Public. Not only is it a month away from the election, or from the previous election, November 3rd, exactly a year to go today, almost at the exact time that I'm speaking right now, we were launching this center on campus with lots of great people around campus. It was so exciting. And actually, I'm wearing the exact same thing. I mean, I almost never wear this. Kate knows this. I never wear a suit except for that day and basically this day. Or not, it's not a suit. It's more of a sports coat. But it's a big day for us. There's been a lot the year 2020 has been an interesting year in terms of misinformation, disinformation. We've assembled a great team and we've collaborated with great people across campus. So I just wanted to note that. I also should introduce myself. I'm currently the director of the Center for an Informed Public and will be for another year. And then Kate, will be the director for the Center for Important Public in September. I'm also an associate professor in the Information School and work a lot also in the Data Lab. So I am going to just encourage everyone that's attending, and thank you all for attending. I see all these great names of people I recognize and people I don't recognize, and that's great too. We encourage you to submit questions after the initial opening remarks from Patrick and Kate, and then we will set our own set of give our own set of questions. Allison will and I will throw some questions at Patrick and Kate, and then it's up to you to continue the conversation. So we encourage you to do that. So with that, I want to turn it over to Patrick to take over the stage. So thank you, Patrick, for being here, and we're looking forward to hearing from you.
Thanks, Jevin, and thanks again for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here today. Just, quickly get up my presentation. Let's see. Even with practice, I'm still struggling. Let's see here. Okay. Does everyone see my my PowerPoint slides?
We see it, Patrick. Perfect.
Okay, great. I just got a note of internet connections, so my apologies. If anything, I can always turn my my video off. But all that being said, thanks for inviting me. Again, I'm Patrick Berry. I'm a lawyer at the Brennan Center for Justice. And I'm really happy to be here today to speak with you all about voting during the 2020 election. But before I begin, I would just like to start with just a brief background about the Brennan Center. So the Brennan Center is a nonpartisan law and public policy institute that's our systems of democracy and justice. We're a hybrid organization, part think tank, advocacy group, law firm, and communications hub, and our work in each one of these areas supports and strengthens our work in the others. On the Voting Rights and Elections team, we've advocated for proposals to expand access to registered voting, like online voter registration and early voting. We do this work around the country, including in Washington State, by providing research, drafting model legislation, and testifying before legislatures. We also file lawsuits to block restrictive voting policies that make it harder to vote. Today, my presentation is going to focus on what was done or wasn't done to make voting easier in 2020 in light of the pandemic. I'm also going to talk about common obstacles voters faced across the country, as well as election efforts to undermine the outcome of the presidential election, and also just some general reflection, good and bad, about this year's elections. So in terms of efforts to expand access to the tireless work of public officials and advocates across the country, 35 states and DC changed their policies through the pandemic to make voting more accessible. Changes to vote by mail generally included significantly expanding who can vote by mail, providing postage for returning or notary or witness requirements. Changes to in-person voting generally included significantly expanding early voting by adding additional days or significantly increasing hours. Since the start of the pandemic, advocates also filed as many as 165 lawsuits in state and federal courts seeking to protect voters' rights across the country, with pro-voter outcomes in approximately 108 cases. Outside of these changes, there were some other notable expansions to voting access for Americans with past. In Iowa, the governor issued an executive order restoring the rights of tens of thousands of Iowans barred from voting for life. And in Washington, D.C., lawmakers also passed a law restoring the right to vote to people in prison. At the same time, some states actually put into place new obstacles to the ballot box. For 2 states, Kentucky and Iowa, enacted new voter ID requirements to effect for the 2020 election. And as the president conspiracy theories about mail ballot collection, Oklahoma also enacted new restrictions on who may assist a voter with returning their absentee ballot. Many states also refused reasonable accommodations for voters in light of the pandemic. Florida, for example, did not change its policy of requiring absentee ballots received by county election officials 10 days before election day. And voters in Kansas, Louisiana, Oklahoma, and South Carolina were also required to get their absentee ballots notarized or witnessed, making it difficult and for some nearly impossible to return their ballots without risking exposure to COVID-19. 5 states, Indiana, Louisiana, Mississippi, Tennessee, and Texas, even refused to change their policies to allow all voters to vote by mail. At the same time, there was also advocacy in the courts to actually hamper state efforts to increase access to the polls. The Trump campaign and the Republican National Committee filed as many as 77 lawsuits to restrict access to voting, everything from stopping secure drop boxes to limiting the days when ballots can be received, often citing bogus claims that voting by mail invites fraud. And while district courts ruled more often than not in favor of voting rights and expanded access to the ballot, federal appeals courts stocked with Trump appointees blocked many of those rulings. At the same time, the US Supreme Court also displayed an unwillingness to strongly protect voting rights, rejecting changes to election rules to address the pandemic in Alabama, Carolina, Texas, and Wisconsin on the grounds that they came too close to the election. The court also refused to review a federal court decision barring thousands of otherwise eligible Florida voters with past convictions from voting simply because they could not afford to pay their fines and fees. As has been the case in the past, voter suppression was an issue for this year's election, and these obstacles disproportionately affect Black, Latino, and other minority voters. On and before Election Day, voters were forced to contend with long lines, malfunctioning voting machines, closed polling places, among many other obstacles to voting. This was true even for November's election, despite the unprecedented number of voters who either voted early or by mail. And to demonstrate just how rampant these obstacles were for November's election, the nonpartisan voter protection hotline received over 30,000 calls on election day alone. And voters in some states also deeply troubling instances of voter intimidation. I was one of thousands of people who volunteered to do election protection on November 3rd. And over the day, I saw reports of voter intimidation in 2 of the 6 states I was monitoring, Arizona and Texas. These reports of intimidation included multiple incidents of present polling locations, reports of armed individuals outside of polling places, hostile and confrontation demonstrations, groups of people physically blocking voters from access to the place or even blocking traffic. There were also voter intimidation in Alabama, Florida, Louisiana, Mississippi, and North Carolina. Many voters who vote by mail this year also encountered obstacles beyond witness requirements or the Postal Service. Not everyone is equally likely to lose their vote. According to news reports, over 550,000 mail ballots were rejected during the presidential race, and these disproportionately harmed Black voters. And in North Carolina, Black voters disproportionately had their mail ballots flagged for rejection up to a day. Attempts to suppress the vote continued at third as well. The Trump campaign and his supporters have filed over 50 lawsuits in federal court since Election Day, alleging widespread fraud and election mismanagement. But in court, they've been unable to substantiate those claims in really any serious way, which is why most of these have been shot down or withdrawn, and no court has found even a single instance of fraud. Even worse, these lawsuits have been predominantly aimed at invalidating ballots in cities or counties with the largest Black or Latino populations and should be seen as what they are: racialized voter suppression. These cases that the president's campaign have initiated or joined since Election Day are a transparent attempt to undermine the outcome and public perception of the integrity of this election. And it's not hard to see what's going on here because the president himself has said that he actually wants the courts to decide the outcome of the presidential race. How elections work in this country, voters decide elections. In all, there was good news from November's election worth celebrating. For starters, the election actually happened. Over many months, election officials on both sides of the aisles worked tirelessly to ensure voters had meaningful access to safe and healthy voting options. Businesses also stepped up from providing PPE to transforming stadiums and arenas into voting sites for November's election. Also deserving credit is the broad-based movement that transformed access to voting in many states over the last 5 years, both through policies that make it easier to vote and through on-the-ground organizing and voter registration drives. And despite a raging pandemic and relentless attempts to suppress the vote, there was also historic turnout for November's election. Nevertheless, these elections also underscored the many ways in which our democracy urgently needs reform. Voters, simply put, should not have to fight through barriers to cast the ballot that counts, and political actors should not be turning to the courts to undermine people's faith in the election system and in our democracy. And with that, I will turn things over to Kate, and I look forward to the Q&A.
All right, I can take the screen unless we want to do another transition. Okay, I'm going to talk about particularly misinformation and specifically disinformation in election 2020 and kind of map that to some of the things that Patrick was talking there at the end of his talk. I'm going to start with this screenshot of a tweet from President Trump. This was sent about a week ago. One of many that he sent out in the past several months, claiming that the election was rigged. And it's part of an ongoing effort to cast doubt on the results of the US presidential election, and one that has been leading to litigation and tied in some ways to their many lawsuits. This tweet, of course, wasn't the first time we'd seen this. We can go back into June, I think, and back into 2016 if we want to go that far. But we've been seeing these same kind of claims from Donald Trump, as well as many of his supporters, talking about how the election was rigged, it was going to be rigged. Back in June, it was mostly about mail-in ballots, but the underlying narrative was the same, is that the election was going to be rigged against Donald Trump. And so we were working since August, we at the Center for Informed Public, as well as with several collaborators in different places that I'll talk a little bit about, to try to address these false claims as well as other sort of threats to election integrity that were in the information space. And we were working as part of the Election Integrity Partnership. That was a collaboration with four different organizations, including Stanford, Graphica, and the DFR Lab, and our Center for an Informed Public. We had over 120 researchers, as well as partners in government, the tech platforms, and civil society. And what we were trying to do is do rapid analysis on emergent stories that had some underlying element that was a threat to election integrity. And one of those was, we were looking at sort of different dimensions, and we were looking at sort of misinformation, disinformation regarding election procedures, things that may lead to voter suppression, including voter intimidation, actual cases where people were trying to incite people to commit fraud or talking about committing fraud in some way. And then what eventually became the main focus of our work was this content around election delegitimization. And I want to talk mostly about that today. First, I think I want to describe a couple of different terms that we tend to use, and I want to make sure we understand the distinctions. We have misinformation and disinformation. Misinformation is information that's false, but not necessarily intentionally false. And certainly we saw some rumors and false rumors develop around election 2020, both beforehand and on election day and afterwards. But more of what we saw was actually something I would call disinformation. And that's false or misleading information that's purposefully seeded or spread for a specific objective, usually a financial or political or a reputational one. Here, a lot of it was for political objectives. And disinformation is something we've been talking about for some time. In 2016, we were talking about, the story was foreign disinformation. So Russia had used a hack and leak operation in combination with inauthentic accounts to sort of sow division in the United States and try to discourage specifically Democratic voters from showing up on election day. In 2020, the disinformation story was very different. We didn't see much foreign disinformation. They tried, but they weren't really as effective this time around. But we saw a lot of domestic disinformation from verified or blue check accounts spreading sort of homegrown disinformation that cuts to the heart of democracy. And I want to show you a couple of cases and kind of show some of the dynamics of what we saw happening. So this is a tweet back from September, and it claims to be an image of mail-in ballots being discarded. There were a lot of these circulating, and this one is sent out by a conservative or a right-wing journalist, and they are claiming that these are mail-in ballots, and they say that they've been discarded in a landfill, and this is big if true, right? So they're spreading it. They're not quite sure that it's true, but they think it might be helpful to them. So it turns out it's not true. The ballots were actually from 2018, and they were being recycled. So they had nothing to do with the election 2020 case. But what was happening was that this person saw this as an opportunity to further kind of throw doubt on the integrity of the election, particularly around mail-in ballots. And so it is fed into that narrative that the election was rigged or was going to be rigged. And so one of the things that's really interesting is to look at how this tweet goes viral, and it eventually does. It gets more than 20,000 retweets, eventually gets removed from the platforms, but not until it gets a lot of spread. So I want to talk a little bit about this graph. I'll show you another similar one later, but it looks at the spread of this particular tweet. And its original author is Elijah Schaefer, and he sends this tweet out. So this is a graph that shows the cumulative count of the number of tweets that have been spread over time. So on the x-axis is time, on the y-axis is the number of tweets that have been spread about these ballots in a dumpster in Sonoma, California. And each of these little shapes here is actually a tweet. There's different kinds of tweets, and it's sized by the size of the audience or the number of followers that each Twitter account that sent that tweet had. So if we look at this sort of tweet, it starts out, it's not growing very fast, and then eventually it starts to grow quite fast after a series of tweets. So if we look at who is actually sharing these tweets, you get a kind of understanding of the ecosystem of who's spreading this kind of mis and disinformation. So the original poster had a right-wing media background, but then it goes through other right-wing media outlets, including influential social media accounts, some associated with the QAnon movement that are not verified accounts, but many of these others were verified accounts. And eventually went out through the Twitter account of President Trump's son, Donald Trump Jr. And I show this case not because it's an anomaly, it's actually something we see over and over and over again with many different kinds of narratives that were spreading before the election. And so leading up to the election, we were trying to characterize what this information space looked like. And we were talking about it as network of activists, social media influencers, and hyper-partisan media outlets continuously were picking up evidence of voting concerns that other people may have shared, and then framing that evidence in misleading ways and strategically amplifying that content to support this sort of meta-narrative that attempted to undermine trust in the election. And this was something that we noted was a problem. And we were thinking about going into the election, we actually started thinking about how do we map this kind of behavior, what we're seeing, to what we should expect on election day. And we put out this graph. I'm not gonna be able to tell you all about it, but we looked at what was gonna happen on election day, how certain incidents and issues were going to be talked about, and how they would be framed into these claims of voter fraud, especially as we had the uncertainty of election on election night, of the uncertainty of the results on election night. And then as we were expecting to see shifts from the red waves and blue waves, so shifts from red to blue and blue to red. And we had kind of mapped out how sort of misinformation was going to spread at that time. And a couple of those things turned out to be more true than we'd hoped. One of the things that was interesting in these dynamics was that Donald Trump had actually called for an army of poll watchers, army for Trump of poll watchers. And this was right before the election. And we had seen this as sort of serving a dual purpose. One was fostering fear of voter intimidation at the polls, maybe even sparking voter intimidation, but certainly this content fostered fear of voter intimidation and possibly was a suppression kind of activity. But it was also inspiring all of these Trump supporters to go to the polls and try to collect evidence of malfeasance of some kind. And that's exactly what they did. After the election, we could see all of this, or actually on the election day and afterwards, these content being shared about malfunctioning voting machines, conflicts with poll workers, claims of people moving ballots around in suitcases, claims that voting machines were switching votes, and then later all of these attempts to sort of torture statistics to claim massive voter fraud. So, and we've seen that all kind of stir together and eventually come out as lawsuits and different kinds of things. I want to show you one case to just give you a sense of how this dynamic works, because I think it's really important for understanding disinformation around election 2020 and what's happening. So this is a prominent narrative about Sharpie pens possibly invalidating votes. And they had, the case was that people were finding that Sharpie pens bled through on their ballots and they were worried that this was going to invalidate their vote. Early tweets on the election day kind of show people being a little bit concerned. But over time, that concern becomes suspicion, becomes explicit accusation that that these Sharpie pens were handed only to Trump voters and was part of an intentional effort to disenfranchise specifically Trump voters. And so we see this kind of a collection of evidence, first concern, then accusation happening with this, and it maps to some other narratives as well, but this one is pretty interesting, related to election voting or voter fraud or ballots. I want to focus in on this. So this is a little temporal graph on the bottom of tweets over time, but I want to focus on this one window when it first takes off. When this idea that Sharpies were somehow used to disenfranchise Trump voters takes off. So we have some initial reports of Sharpies bleeding through on, I knew that was going to happen, my rice is ready. Sorry, if you can hear that, I apologize. But we had some initial reports of Sharpies bleeding through on election day. But later, the Sharpiegate narrative begins to really pick up sort of overnight or early morning Eastern time. These graphs are in UTC, but this is like, this period picks up around 2 a.m. in the morning. So this surge here of votes, so when this graph begins to take off, are complaints around Sharpies that occur after Fox News has called Arizona for Joe Biden. And all these Sharpie claims had been in many states, but they begin to focus on Sharpie claims in Arizona, in Maricopa County. And then they begin to focus their efforts on claiming that there's some sort of malfeasance that's going on here. If we look closer at what accounts are kind of pushing this content, making it go viral, it's a similar kind of group of right-wing influencers, including conservative activist Charlie Kirk and Trump's 2 adult sons. I will give you a sense of what the content is. This tweet's been deleted, but Charlie Kirk here early on tweets out that a retweet of someone else to ask what's going on here, question mark. But there's this claim that these Sharpies were leading to fraud in Arizona. So one of the things here is that we see these repeat offenders, influential accounts that repeatedly help election disinformation go viral. We actually mapped this network out pre-election. This is a table from pre-election. We're currently working on post-election. But as you can see here, it's mostly verified accounts, blue check accounts. The green folks here are conservative political activists at Turning Point USA and Judicial Watch. The orange folks here are accounts of hyperpartisan news outlets, and the aqua are actually members of Trump's family and part of his campaign. So I want to finish here to kind of return to this tweet, I think from the beginning of this talk posted last week, and this claim that the election has been rigged, and kind of think about disinformation in this election as this participatory phenomenon where President Trump and his campaign didn't just prime his audience to be receptive to false narratives of voter fraud. He did that, but that wasn't all he did. They also inspired them to produce these narratives, like Sharpie Gate or suitcases of voters or observers being denied access to the voting places. So they inspired their crowds to create these narratives and then echoed those false claims back to them. So it's this back and forth, or top down and bottom up way of fostering what became, what has become a massive effort to undermine trust in the elections. So disinformation in 2020 is participatory. And for that reason, I think these misperceptions about election 2020 are going to be very hard to correct, because they actually came from the audiences. These people, they really feel they experienced this. They were disenfranchised. Their votes maybe didn't count because they were using Sharpie pens. And also to kind of think about how our information systems are wired to spread disinformation, and what that means from a legal side, from a platform side, and how we think about not only how to address this case, but how to address cases going forward, because clearly this is actually a threat to democracy. It's a threat to our trust in whether or not our systems of democratic systems work. And I think we really are going to need to address this going forward. All right, just thank you to all of the collaborators and all of the folks that have been involved in this project. And I will pass the baton back over.
Thanks, Kate, and thanks, Patrick, too. Those are great overviews, and they really give us a lot to dig into. Let's just have a couple of questions from Jevin and me, and then we'll jump into the Q&A. I guess one of the things I wanted to ask sort of at the beginning was, there were things that we've always sort of taken for granted about our election process and how things work, and Kate started to get into this a little bit at the end. Maybe Patrick, you want to lead on this one, but what are things that we have to rethink for future? Are there things we no longer believe about our process, or what do we still believe? So I'll throw that to Patrick first, and then see if Kate wants to make a way back around to it. And that'll give you all a chance to post in the Q&A, and Jevin and me to jump in there and start seeing what's in there.
So in terms of things that I think that we can't take for granted, is just how election officials were able to pull November's election off. I think it's important to emphasize just how much work went into November's election. There was just a tremendous amount of legal and policy changes to make the election work. A lot of voters, including myself, voted in ways that we have never voted before. For the primary election, I live in Brooklyn. I voted by mail, which, in Washington State, you have universal vote by mail. And it was the first time that I did that. But for the general election, I actually opted to vote early in person. And that was the case across the country. And there were also just massive lifts for election officials at the same time to do things that they haven't done before. So there were a number of states like California and Nevada that, for example, had to administer an all-mail election. And so we don't know what the impact that's going to have on future elections. But we do think that there will be a lasting impact. Especially since, a number of these changes that were made for November's election were temporary, meaning that, there's a possibility that in New York, for the next election, I may not be able to vote by mail if I want to, because in New York, you actually need one of the requirements prescribed, one of the valid excuses provided by law in order to qualify to vote by mail. And this year, Governor Cuomo issued an executive order saying that COVID-19 was considered a valid excuse. And so I think, that's just something that we can't take for granted.
Thanks, Patrick. And before Kate jumps in, I noticed there's one question in the chat that's sort of related to this, which is about voting online. Someone says, I can bank from my phone. Why can't I vote from my phone? Do you want to add anything to that before Kate jumps in on her side?
So my colleagues that work on election security would be better able to answer that. But my general impression is that there just seem to be a lot of risks with voting online. And it just is safer to, do it, especially if there's a paper trail. So while voting online seems like it would be really convenient, it seems like there are a number of risks associated with that.
I think that leads well into the statement I was going to try to make here, is that the actual integrity of the election doesn't necessarily map to the perceptions of election integrity, especially in this world where there are efforts to sort of undermine trust in democracy, whether it's from foreign actors who may want to do that, or in this case, a set of domestic actors who thought it might be politically useful for them to do that. And so for something like online voting, though it might be convenient, and though it actually may be something that is more secure, the perceptions of security are going to be a lot higher when we have those paper ballot trails and we're able to do those hand recounts and go over them in those ways. And so I think we really do have to think about not only how do we make the election safe and secure, but how do we help people understand that it's safe and secure. And then another piece about that for me is about sort of transparency and criticism. So on the transparency side, we have this idea that the more transparent things are going to make things better. And we actually saw these live streams that were happening inside the counting areas, be used to make things more transparent. And yet when it came to trying to undermine trust in the vote, people took those live streams, they cut them up, and they made it seem like they were evidence of malfeasance. And so we really have to think about those kinds of things, as well as how do we give people the access they need to make sure that we have the faith that we need to have in these results, but also understand how some folks might want to undermine our trust, and how certain kinds of information and certain kinds of things will help them do that.
Perfect. Thanks, Patrick and Kate. I think they're both super informative. And I think there's going to be 3 hours of questions that we're going to need to go through. But let me just start with a pretty simple one for both of you. And Kate, why don't you go first? What was most surprising to you about the 2020 election? And then Patrick, you can jump in if Kate's still thinking, or whatever, who wants to jump in.
From the disinformation side, what's so surprising is that it was almost so predictable. Not we alone, but like we in the community of people talking about these things, whether from the election security side or the mis and disinformation side, we could foresee this moment. This moment was very much predicted to be happening in terms of having President Trump in particular denying the current results and claiming election fraud. It was just, we could see how it was all going to progress, and we knew that the switch from red to blue in some states was going to be used as part of their theories, and we could just kind of predict what was going to happen, down to like the affidavits being filed, the bad statistics being used to claim voter fraud. I mean, we laid it out, and so many of those things came true. And I was actually surprised at how the predictions, were so similar to how things came apart. Even though we couldn't predict Sharpiegate, we could predict that they were going to take evidence of things that were going wrong on election day and try to blend those into to false claims of voter fraud.
Patrick, what was most surprising to you?
So in terms of things that were very surprising to me, something that immediately comes to mind is I actually had the pleasure and honor of working on a ballot measure in California that it was Proposition 17 that was overwhelmingly approved by voters on November 3rd to restore voting rights to people on parole who are living in the communities. And one would have expected the fact that Prop was approved by over 60% of voters, that, voters would have also approved a measure, Proposition 18, that would have allowed 17-year-olds to vote in primaries so long as that they would have been eligible to vote in the general election. There were also a number of other ballot measures related to rent control, taxes to pay for schools and other things, criminal justice reform that failed, while yet a ballot proposal, Proposition 22, was also approved by voters related to gig economy jobs like Uber and Lyft. And essentially what Proposition 22 will do is it companies like Uber and Lyft from complying with state labor laws. And so it was pretty surprising to see how voters ultimately voted on various ballot measures. But in terms of my thoughts in trying to explain them, with Proposition 18 to allow 17-year-olds to vote, I think there wasn't really much money spent and public education around that. I think there was a lot of confusion. And so it's possible people thought that, we wanted 17-year-olds to vote in the general election, which I guess is scary to some. And then, of course, with Proposition 22, there was just an immense amount of money that was spent. I mentioned earlier that I live in New York City. There were nights that I actually got Proposition 22 commercials while watching TV. So that was, just pretty extraordinary. And so, going into November 3rd, I thought, the outcome in terms of ballot measures would be different. But it turns out that, they weren't. But fortunately, Prop 17 passed. So.
Thanks, Patrick. I was going to ask about some of the stories and cases. You're already giving us some, and I noticed in the chat there's some interest in the Georgia Senate race. So I don't know if either you, Patrick, or Kate, certainly any of your examples are interesting, but trying to reflect back to the questions a little bit. If you want to reflect on Georgia for a minute, that would be great. Patrick, are you tracking that one?
So I haven't been tracking Georgia too closely, but what I can say is that I do think Georgia is an example of something that I said during my presentation of years of groundwork, really to try to do a lot of organizing and also voter registration efforts. And I think that was evidenced, looking at the level of turnout on election day. And I also think that Georgia represents, what happens when there are all of these baseless claims of voter fraud and just people feeling emboldened to, threaten people with violence. And it just so happens that, now election officials and the Secretary of State are unfortunately subject to those sorts of attacks.
Yeah, just building off that last part, I think one of the interesting things to think about is we're seeing this attack on election integrity, and Georgia's become a focus of it, even as they're about to try to run another election. And you can actually see Republicans begin to worry that these messages undermining, the democratic process will actually be a voter suppression act as voter suppression on their side. And so they're already starting to see the negative outcomes or the potential negative outcomes of this kind of attack on democracy. And it is an interesting case for that in many reasons. Certainly there's a lot of misinformation, disinformation, both about the general election in Georgia and then going forward into their runoffs.
So we have several interesting questions that are coming in. And so I'm going to try to maybe pull a couple together that are similar, that have similar themes. But one, there's been several questions related to one that Allison mentioned about the voting process itself. And I think this would probably be more directed to you, Patrick. One of the questions is about kind of the tracking number. So if we don't go with our phones because of some of these technology issues that you mentioned from your colleagues, the question from Victor is, can the process of ballots or voting be made easier for people to know that their ballot is counted? So here in Washington, we can look up our ballot, that it's been collected and tabulated. Can people who vote in person get a tracking number or something like that? I know there's been a lot of discussion around that online recently since the November 3rd election.
So that's a really great question, and it's kind of funny because I've seen that being discussed before, but I don't know to that. But I mean, I don't know how they would work that out. I would also just say, though, that while in Washington, voters are able to track their ballot when they vote by mail, that necessarily isn't the case in other states. It really does vary. Texas, for example, the only voters who can track their mail ballots are people that are overseas in the military. Other voters don't have, the option of tracking their mail ballots.
That's interesting about Texas. Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, and I think Victor, more people should be asking that. It's super interesting, Patrick, about Texas. Allison, do you want to take a couple? I'm sort of
Sure.
Keeping track
yeah.
of a few.
No, I know there's a lot coming in. Well, this is interesting about misinformation. Kate, you covered some of the stories on that and the particular individuals and groups who, seem to be heavily involved. And one of the questions that's coming in is, we talk a lot about misinformation spreading among conservatives or persuadables who can easily shift their mindset into one that could be labeled conservative. Is misinformation a similar concern for liberal or left-wing voters? And how can we prevent or halt, a similar trend of mass and rampant misinformation, disinformation in some cases, across the board, I should say, really, because, I'll throw that over to Kate.
Yeah, so in 2016, in terms of disinformation, we saw it targeting people on the left as much as people on the right. We actually saw the foreign disinformation campaign was actually a pretty symmetrical in terms of its targeting on the left and the right. It actually had more pickup from the Russia's Internet Research Agency campaign that we were able to see more closely, had more pickup on the left, and it was actually trying to discourage Democratic voters from voting. And we don't know what impact it had, but certainly that was the goal. And we can see the accounts of getting followed and retweeted by people who are U.S. left-leaning people. So I do think we're all vulnerable in terms of like election issues related to election integrity. Certainly if the presidential election had gone a different way, we might have seen some sort of rumoring and conspiracy theorizing and misinformation spreading about the integrity of the election and whether or not the voting machines had changed votes from Biden to Trump, right? So I do think we're all susceptible. I don't think that the left currently has the same infrastructure to spread that stuff. We do have some left-leaning accounts that do kind of have a lot of followers and spread conspiracy theories, but they're not so integrated into the sort of media and political leaders as we're seeing on the right in terms of spreading this stuff.
Yeah, just to follow that really quickly, are there, what are the consequences, right? Are there disincentives or negative consequences that we can, what would be a way to prevent this with sort of disincentives or negative consequences? What do we know about that?
I mean, from whom, right? Who's going to be, I mean, from voters, they didn't seem to experience negative consequences. Maybe they're fearing that in Georgia, but they don't, the folks on the right don't have that kind of fear. In terms of like the platforms, I do think the platforms did try to address disinformation around the election integrity in ways that they hadn't in the past. They were updating their policies, they're still updating their policies today, so they're updating their policies all along. One of the things they didn't necessarily do was to identify these repeat offenders and start punishing people who were repeatedly spreading misinformation. They're still doing it on a piece-by-piece basis for the most part. They've talked about policies. They have some policies for repeat offenders, but they haven't really enacted them or used them. And I think there's a real opportunity to say, hey, these are networks that are now wired to spread this stuff. They activate over and over again to spread. We have Donald Trump and his sons in like 20 to 30 different incidents if we look across the breadth of our data, and they're not the only ones. There's other accounts that are just smaller bubbles that we can't see as well, but the platforms could take action more systematically on these networks to limit their ability to spread this stuff.
Thanks. I'll throw it over to Jevin.
Yeah, so there's an interesting question from Steve. So he says, thank you very much for your critical work and dedication to all the things you talked about in your talk. I heard a recent Radio Lab episode on one particular election fraud conspiracy thread hinging on Benford's Law. It was interesting because a complicated statistical concept was basically taken out of context, but still used as some kind of scientific justification for election fraud. Have you seen other types of themes among these conspiracies that seemingly try to shoehorn their explications in science?
I would just like to hold up a mirror and then let Jevin answer that question.
Well, I'll say,
yeah.
I mean, I can say real quickly that we have a postdoctoral fellow in the center. His name's Joe Bach Coleman, and he's done a bunch of work tracking a lot of these numbers and stats. In fact, we put up a post in the center about Benford's Law in particular, and that and many other kinds of, as Kate said in her slides so well, what was it, statistical wrangling or
torturing statistics.
Torturing statistics, yes. And so I'll make a quick thing, or make a quick statement about Benford's Law. It was being misused just because you see a distribution of numbers. I won't spend the whole time explaining Benford's Law, but it's the leading number of any number. So 3,482, 3 is the leading number. If you add up a whole bunch of those and you look at those tallies across counties, across the United States, some were claiming that it wasn't following Benford's Law, therefore that's evidence of election fraud. And I'll just quickly say that's not the case for various reasons, for reasons that violate many assumptions needed for Benford's Law to actually provide the credence you need. So that more of that's being used to use, statistics, science. We see that in conspiracy theories more generally. So that's certainly something that we're seeing more. So Kate, if you wanted to follow up on anything there with other things that you've seen.
Yeah, I don't have much more to add except for that Joe and others have debunked not just the claims around Benford's Law, but a lot of claims around statistical anomalies and with the election that were then used to say, oh, there must have been someone switching votes because this is weird or that is weird. And when the real statisticians go into it, and especially ones that understand voting and understand precinct sizes and all these other things, that those claims just fall apart. But they look really convincing if you don't understand the math very well. And many of us don't. And so we have to rely on someone to translate that for us. And there are people out there who are happy to translate that in ways. Sometimes they're trying to get it right, but they have a foregone conclusion. And so they're interpreting the data in order to fit this foregone conclusion of voter fraud. And their explanations of that can be very convincing, whether it be on YouTube or TikTok or wherever else. And so that has been a major theme of disinformation about election fraud in 2020.
Yeah, it's definitely continued. So I'll throw this question and then I'll turn it back over to Allison as well. So Patrick, I think this one's more for you. I think it's an interesting question here about, some have suggested that federal elections ought to be national and controlled centrally. It seemed the dispersed nature of the election was actually a protection against election interference. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I certainly agree with that. You can look at efforts in Michigan and Pennsylvania, and other states, Wisconsin, Georgia even. And I think, that just demonstrates the benefit to not having it being centralized.
Thanks. I'll jump back in. Maybe we'll start with Patrick this time and then throw it back to Kate again. What kind of research is there on the effectiveness of voter intimidation efforts? People reporting that they did not vote because of fear. And then Kate, I'm going to ask you to follow up on that with, how effective are these disinformation campaigns? How do we measure that? How do we understand that?
So I'm personally not aware of the research, but I mean, it just, I think just makes sense that voter intimidation can be, really effective. Especially when you think about, the communities that have historically been targeted with voter intimidation. On election day, when I was doing election protection, and I was seeing, countless reports of voter intimidation coming in from Arizona and Texas, including reports of a border patrol truck sitting stationed outside of a polling location. I believe it was in Arizona. Just thinking myself, I live in New York City, that, fortunately isn't an issue, often. But I couldn't even imagine what it's like, to subject yourself, or not to subject yourself, but to, show up to vote and have to experience people, with guns, people that are honking their horns at you, screaming at you, blocking your ability to access the polling location, And it definitely makes sense that, if someone shows up and they experience that, or if they go on social media and they talk about the fact that that sort of intimidation is happening, that it's going to dissuade other voters from showing up and voting. And, the unfortunate reality is that when that happens on election day, your options for voting, other than doing so in person, are, incredibly limited. So it can be incredibly effective.
Yeah, thanks for that. And Kate, on
to build off of that, one of the things we were really interested in worried about was actually that there would be some physical intimidation, and that images or videos about that intimidation would begin to go viral and be taken out of context and suppress votes in other places. So we were actually, it was one of the content areas we were focused on. Fortunately, we didn't see a lot of those things going viral. We actually expected to see them amplified, not just by people on the left, but by people on the right as well, for different kinds of political motives. But it turned out to be a much smaller thing than we were expecting on election day. It had been bigger in some of the earlier voting days. But it is something to think about, is those images and photos of actual and videos of actual voter intimidation can have a secondary effect of voter suppression in our current information environment.
Thanks. I'll throw it back down to Jevin.
Yeah, so there's just so many. I'm just trying to prioritize all these great questions, but I'll just go with what's on top and has the most thumbs up right now. So I thought of, this is from Callie. I thought a lot of the examples shown today were awesome examples of single posts by users. What is your perspective in terms of paid advertisements, and how, if those are being regulated and received? Whoever wants to take that one, Patrick or Kate.
Yeah, I'll start. I mean, on the misinformation side, disinformation, we did a couple of things at our group, and then I'll talk a little bit maybe about what other groups may be doing. But we did collection of Google advertisements and using a service that allowed to collect what the advertisements would be for certain search terms in swing states and other places that we thought would be hotspots for misinformation. And to be honest, like the top Google ads, for the most part, there were some examples that were problematic, and we reported them to Google and others, and especially early on. But on election, leading up the week or two before the election day, and afterwards, we actually didn't see a lot of exploitation of ads, unless people went to search for voter fraud. Then that would lead you down sort of a right-wing rabbit hole about voter fraud. But for just searching where to vote or how to vote or what was going on or election results, they actually did a pretty good job on the Google side. Now, there are advertisements coming from all over in different places, and I know there are other projects that would be good to point out here. Maybe Jevin, I'm just forgetting the name of the person we had come in last week to talk about their project, tracking ads.
Oh yeah, well, Sarah, I'm blanking too. Oh my goodness, I'm having the same problem. Yeah.
But there are other great projects that were tracking ads around. But I haven't seen a lot of clear stories about that yet, about the exploitation of ads around the voter fraud kinds of narratives.
So Patrick, I don't know if you want to take a swing at that one or if you want me to change it up.
We can change it up.
Okay, so we've had a question sitting here for a little while. It's about trust, trust in government, which is low at the moment. And the question is about racialized voter suppression, but what does it look like to bring trust back to our public institutions? Who has a roadmap for that? How does a racial lens help inform the conversation around trust in government? Does voter access and sort of the issues around that right now, does that reflect some sort of turning point in this, or the recent election, even though we had many issues with it, do you think there's evidence there that there's been some sort of shift, or is trust still on its own trend and voter access on another?
Sure. So I think it's both. I think there's a lot of distrust that will likely continue over the next couple of years, and I think that distrust in the voting system will largely be a result of efforts to claim that there's widespread voter fraud And as in the past, those false claims will be used to pass laws that will make it even more difficult to vote by mail or vote in person. I do think that a lot of people, voted this year because they are hoping to have a change where their vote will actually matter and where there will be meaningful opportunities for reforming our democracy. And one thing that, or two pieces of legislation that the Brennan Center is going to be focusing on will be HR 1, which is known as the I can't believe I'm blanking on it. So HR 1, and then also the Restoring the Voting Rights Act. And those are, so For the People Act is HR 1. Those are two pieces of federal legislation that would address the widespread efforts or the widespread and systematic issues that are plaguing our democracy that were really on display for November's election. A lot of the issues that we saw have existed for quite some time, but they affected a smaller segment of the population, often marginalized groups. And so we do think that there is certainly a hunger for a broad and expansive democracy. I think Prop 17 in California is an example of that, and I do think that, should we be able to pass meaningful reforms that make government more responsive to the people, that'll help address some of those trust issues.
So I can answer one of the quick ones from Mary, and then I'll move on to the next set of questions that are in the chat. Mary asked, how does the older book Lying with Statistics fall in disinformation? I can just jump in that real quick because I teach a class on this and I talk a lot about it. I will say this, that yes, it's very much about how these statistics and numbers are being used to lie about the election, but I don't know that I would necessarily recommend that book as much anymore. In fact, I don't list it on my syllabus anymore for kind of the insensitivities that you see in that particular book. It's still, there's good messages there and there's lots to learn from it, but the general sentiment of using numbers and stats to make some of these claims, I think is a real thing. And it's something actually we talk a lot about in our center. So I think this will be a hard question because, most of, Patrick, you're not in Washington State. I know that, this isn't your main area of expertise, Kate, but please summarize what you think the highest priority steps are to be taking in Washington State. So let's extend that to other states more generally. What are some of the things that we should be taking around this issue in the misinformation world, and also sort of in the voting world? I think both of you could take that, but more generalized, not just in Washington, but more generally.
And can I just add one thing? It says, as we head into our legislative session. So it's interesting to think about legislative solutions to any of this, if you think such a thing is possible. Thanks, Javid.
So just really quickly, so although you're correct, I do not live in Washington State, I do have one legislative proposal that I would highly recommend for folks that are turning in to focus on. Last session, a bill was introduced that would have restored voting rights to thousands of Washingtonians who are actually vote. And unfortunately, that proposal didn't advance. This year, it's going to be introduced by Representative-elect Tara Simmons. And, we're really hoping that this year, especially, looking at California, a neighbor to Washington State, Washington State is also just generally looked at as a state that really prides itself on having a democracy that's expansive. In 2019, as I'm sure you all know, passing legislation with regards to prison gerrymandering. Restoring voting rights to people on community supervision, just a logical next step. And I will just quickly add that criminal disenfranchisement laws are they come from the Jim Crow era. They were largely used as a means of suppressing the vote of newly reenfranchised Black men after the Civil War. And they continue to have a devastating impact on communities of color today. So in Washington State, that's also true. And as a result, that just further marginalizes, communities that are already marginalized. So that's one piece of legislation that, would address historical injustices while also, expanding democracy.
Thanks, Patrick. I should have known that you were watching Washington as well. I shouldn't have made that assumption. I saw it. And I also remembered, Kate, it was Jennifer Stromer-Galley from Syracuse University that did a bunch of that good advertising. I had the advantage of looking it up. I can't say that I jogged at my memory, but go ahead and if you had a response to that as well, Kate.
I don't have much of a response around misinformation, disinformation around Washington State specifically, mostly because it hasn't been because we weren't a swing state, we weren't really targeted for a lot of those things. And our mail-in voting has already been in place. And so especially in this round, it just wasn't a real opportunity for targeted disinformation. Certainly we're seeing disinformation around other issues, and we look blue, but we're not, we understand we're a purple state, and there are people that, that are on different sides of different kinds of issues. And we're seeing mis and disinformation around like COVID-19 and all sorts of things. But in terms of election 2020, I didn't see a lot of sort of focused disinformation campaigns that were reaching the level of virality that would have caught our attention for the work we were doing.
Thanks, and maybe I'll grab another one off the Q&A. It's still pretty active in there. Could a news guard like Radar or Blocker be built and managed for social messaging so people could install, you could install this and sort of have it active is in your area?
One of the hard questions is, for the people that want to get things right, that might help them a little bit, although a lot of people like to have their own agency in what they see and what they choose to see. And so, yeah, there is a sort of like a middle group of people who would benefit from. The people who most need that, they would never use it. So there is this kind of difficulty, and also we're so polarized that often fact-checking organizations get labeled as one side or the other, and folks that might need to hear their message on one side, often reject the fact-checking because they associate with the other sort of political side. And so there are some tricky questions on like, what kind of tool would help the people who need it the most, and I'm not quite sure what that is, but something that definitely gives people agency, but also helps them see where they might be being manipulated and where sort of information comes from if that was otherwise not as visible to them. So something that gives them more information about information as opposed to something that sort of blocks.
So Patrick and Kate, this is a question for both of you. What can we in the audience, we've had over 100 people listening to this conversation, what can we do to defend democracy, protect voting rights, to prevent voter suppression? What can we do to sort of make the world a little better place and to stop the spread of misinformation and disinformation around these issues? So both, what can we do just generally, and then also in the disinformation space? So kind of to both of you, what could everyone in this audience do to improve the situation?
So one thing that I think was demonstrated certainly from this year's election is volunteering to be a poll worker. If you look at the primary elections, there were just a ridiculous amount of polling place closures because people didn't want to volunteer out of concern of the pandemic, and largely people who do volunteer to be poll workers are highly susceptible to COVID-19. So I do think the reason why there were more in-person voting options this year is because there were a lot of people that were willing to step up and really engage in their civic duties and volunteer and be a poll and work at the polls. So that's certainly a tangible way to contribute. I also think it's important to just continue to stay engaged. I think, showing up to events like this is certainly great. And also, certainly before elections, making sure that you're registered. It's definitely possible for people to, get kicked off the voter rolls by mistake. And also making sure that your friends and are, just aware of what's happening. Often there will be, state elections that fly under the radar. But when you think of, policy that really has an impact on day life, it really is at the state and level.
Thanks. How about you, Kate?
Yeah, on the information side, we have some best practices kind of emerging on how to on what to tell people to hopefully make healthier information spaces. And one of those is, well, some of them are in our own practices to slow down and also to tune in to how information affects us emotionally. A lot of times we think about misinformation as sort of a cognitive, right? But really misinformation and disinformation especially try to activate us to spread it. And so, and that activation is often emotional, and it makes us feel outrage and self-righteousness and on these kinds of things. And we want to spread it. On building off of that, one of the things that we also recommend is people to recognize that that we need to take responsibility individually. Now, that doesn't mean that the platform shouldn't take responsibility. It doesn't mean that media shouldn't take responsibility for their roles in this sort of toxic information space. But as individuals, we are now participants. We're not just information consumers, we're information participants. And some of our examples show that participation is actually part of the disinformation process. Misinformation doesn't spread itself, we spread it. And so to recognize our responsibility, not just in maybe not sharing something, but also to learn to correct ourselves. We're all citizen journalists now. We need to learn how to make a proper retraction, not just hide things, but actually tell people that we've made a mistake, that we passed along something that wasn't true. Learn how to maybe correct others, but with empathy and in ways that don't backfire. So really kind of understand that we all make mistakes. And so you've made a mistake in the past, so has someone else. And so to learn how to maybe create new norms around correction. And then one little piece in this context that I've begun to learn the difference between disinformation and like really healthy criticism, right? There are really things about our society, our government, and even our election processes that need criticism. But learn to recognize the difference between criticism that's there to make something better and criticism that's just there to tear things apart, to undermine our trust and to undermine our faith in our democracy. So as we think about how you're engaging things, I think that distinction maybe can be helpful for people.
It's so interesting to hear you talk about information as contagious and spreading. We're in this pandemic. There's sort of a, how do we inoculate ourselves against this, disease in a way. Patrick, I was wondering if you would like to share something about what your organization is doing, since you talked about what individuals can do who are tuned in and who are listening now. What are next steps for you guys? What are you currently doing? What's happening on the ground? It'd be great to hear about that a little bit. And if there were opportunities for people who are listening to engage with you all, that would also be nice to hear.
Sure. So in terms of things that we're going to be doing, we're going to be, continuing to do the state level advocacy that we've been doing. So trying to advance policies that make it easier to vote, and also just addressing, a number of the issues that we saw occur with this election. And then also, like I mentioned before, at the federal level, really pushing for, the passage of HR 1 and restoring the Voting Rights Act. In terms of ways that listeners can get engaged with the work that the Brennan Center is doing, we have a number of email lists that you can subscribe to. We also just always have, regular events that feature really incredible and brilliant speakers, people that are, on the ground doing really great work. So, and we just have, numerous and tons of resources on our website. So yeah, you can check it out. I'm more than happy to drop it in the chat. But there are certainly ways to follow what we're doing and get engaged.
Great, thanks. Yeah, and do throw it in the chat. And Kate, what about for Center for Informed Public? And I know that you're also involved with several other organizations too, but what's happening on the ground? What are sort of next steps for you guys? I know you're still digesting what happened with this past cycle.
Yeah, for our sort of election integrity partnership with our partner organizations, we're currently trying to write a report, a white paper kind of report, just kind of documenting both our collaboration, how it worked, how we integrated with our different partner organizations, and then the work where we have, you know, over 1,000 different tickets, probably something like 800 different sort of misinformation incidents, and we're trying to kind of document that and give people some insight as to kind of what was driving some of this, some of these false narratives, especially we're interested in the voter fraud ones, but there's other elements as well that we'll be covering. And then we've been doing this action research, like moving a mile a minute, everybody taking shifts and being on and trying to do real-time analysis. And we're gonna stop that and start looking backwards and start doing some proper research, going back to our roots. And we've got a lot of different ideas for research papers, and we've got a great team of students and postdocs and all of that. So we'll be doing that. And then at the Center for Informed Public, we're also really busy on COVID-19. As the vaccine rolls out, that's going to be a real topic of mis and disinformation. And so we will be focusing some resources on that, and may try to map some of what we learned in the election context, especially around sort of pre-bunking and kind of, you know, putting out a what to expect and mapping, like, you know, how the rollout might intersect with certain kinds of periods of misinformation, or possibly certain kinds of events might spark certain kinds of narratives, and maybe think about how what we learned from the election context could be mapped onto the vaccine rollout. Yeah, I'm sure there's other things too, but we're working on all fronts. Jevin has the full list. I just have my little piece right now. I guess I'll have to switch over next year, but Jevin has the whole list of everything the center's working on, and we're busy.
Yeah, this is great. We'd love to partner again sometime. You know, the Dean's Forum at some point will be turning to COVID, you know, from the policy side and from economic recovery and rebuilding and so forth. So it sounds like there could be some interesting interactions there too. Thanks.
Absolutely. I'll jump in and say for sure we should be doing that. And I want to thank all the people that stayed around the talk, stayed and still there at the talk today. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions. All of them were great questions. We could have continued doing that. And yes, absolutely, we should find ways to partner with our two different schools and all the great people that are working in these different units on campus. So let's Allison, let's make sure we can make that happen.
Yeah, that would be great. So I'll just let the panelists have any last words they would like. So Patrick, would you like to grab a couple last words, and then Kate, and then I'll wrap it up.
So I will just quickly say, you know, thank you again for the invitation. And I personally found, you know, what Kate shared very informative and interesting. During election protection, I remember seeing reports about Sharpies, and I just wasn't witnessing what was happening on social media. So it was just really remarkable to see, you know, how that was being spread. So thanks again for inviting me.
Love it. How about you, Kate?
Yeah, I think I've already said all my last words, but it's been really great to be part of this panel and have a chance to talk with Patrick, and then hear this great work, and especially about the rights of those who've previously been incarcerated and things, and thinking about justice. And we often think about, you know, how to make elections safer, but we also have to make it safer and fair and more equitable, and make sure that people have access. And I think, how do we address, if we can properly address some of that, you know, those weaknesses in our system? They're still real, right? We have these real weaknesses in our system. How do we address those without throwing the whole experiment out, right? And we're going to have some years of really struggling in front of us. A lot of people are losing faith in the system for various reasons, and how do we restore that, I think, is the #1 question. I wish I had answers. I don't, but I think bringing together people like this to talk about these things is really going to be an important part of the solution.
Thanks. Well, I really appreciate the chance to partner with Center for an Informed Public, with you, Jevin, and disinformation and misinformation is obviously a really critical component related to these issues that we've been discussing. And Patrick, really appreciate you talking about voter restoration, being able to take action against all the racial injustice, especially around elections. And it's very long-standing and it takes many different forms. And so being able to talk about some of that today, so important. And I want to thank you both for the work that you're doing, not just for coming here tonight and talking to us, but you're out there every day working on these issues, and I appreciate that so much. And I appreciate everyone who tuned in to take part, and we'll have more of these, so please watch for those opportunities. This is the last one for autumn, so so from the Evans School Dean's Forum on Race and Public Policy, I just want to thank everyone for engaging in the conversation. I really appreciate how many people are interested in the election, in the democratic process, in protecting voting rights, in thinking about protecting the soundness of information. I hope everyone has a really safe and healthy season ahead, and we will see you all next time. So thanks.